say goodbye with a smile, dear, just for a while, dear, we must part. Don't let this parting upset you, I'll not forget you, sweetheart.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Trumbore with your nightly review for Monday, April 8. I'll explain that a little later. That is Vera Lynn. It's about Maggie. I'm going to rush through a lot of items so I can spend a little time with Ms. Thatcher, who passed today. It is 4:02 Eastern Time. The Dow Jones finished up 47 points to 14,613, up 0.3%. S&P 500 up 9 points, 0.6% to 1562. NASDAQ up 18, also up 0.6%. Gold 1572, oil 93.60, and the 10-year Treasury 1.75%. Tokyo was up 2.8% to 13,192 on the Nikkei. The yen continues to collapse, which of course is potentially very good for Japanese exporters and not good for our exporters. Not good for our car companies, that's for sure, trying to sell product in Japan. London, Paris, and Frankfurt were all up fractionally. A figure on industrial production rose in Germany for the month of February over January, up 0.5% in line with expectations, but it has not been a good 2 to 3 days for news on the Eurozone. Maybe Germany is an exception, but there is zero signs of a pickup in activity in France, Italy, Spain, the rest of Europe. Italy still doesn't have a government, remember? In France, their finance minister slashed the country's growth forecast to 0.1% for this year. Pierre Moscovici had previously estimated 0.8%. President Hollande built his entire campaign last year on the assumption of a growth rate of 1.7% for 2013, 2% for next year. Not quite. In Portugal, the next mess. The Prime Minister, Pedro Passos Coelho, promised a further squeeze on government spending after the country's constitutional court rejected austerity measures considered essential to meeting mandatory deficit targets. He said we will have to introduce important cuts in expenditure on Social Security, health, and education. We need to do everything possible to avoid a second bailout. We will not increase taxes. I have ordered ministries to cut expenditure to compensate for the effects of the court decision. The economists calculate that the 4 measures ruled unconstitutional in Portugal, including planned cuts in public sector pay and state pensions, mean Lisbon will lose about 1.3 billion euro in expected revenue and savings, more than 20% of the total planned from austerity measures this year. So that means it would increase this year's budget deficit to about 6.5% of GDP, or far higher than the target established by the Troika, the European Commission, the IMF, and the European Central Bank in order for Portugal to get a bailout in the first place. EU finance ministers will be meeting in Dublin this weekend, and Portugal is going to be at the top of the agenda. In Greece, its 2 largest lenders are heading for state control after their merger was halted by the government over the weekend. As the Wall Street Journal reported, the unexpected move came after National Bank of Greece and Eurobank came up short in their plans to raise capital, and amid fears by the country's international lenders that the combined entity could become too big to be bailed out. So Europe's just really in great shape. A story first hit early morning in Seoul, South Korea, that North Korea was preparing for its fourth nuclear test, but a South Korean Defense Ministry spokesman quickly said, "We found there had been no unusual movements that indicated Pyongyang wanted to carry out a nuclear test." The report, however, followed a warning from Chinese President Xi Jinping, who at a conference said a number of things. To wit, no one should be allowed to throw a region and even the whole world into chaos for selfish gains, in what was a clear but indirect reference to North Korea, reflecting growing Chinese frustration with North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. Xi said stability in Asia now faces new challenges as hotspot issues keep emerging. Governments should attempt to foster a sense of community rather than transforming the world into an arena where gladiators fight each other. He continued, stability in Asia now faces new challenges as hotspot issues keep emerging, and both traditional and non-traditional security threats exist. The international community should advocate the vision of comprehensive security and cooperative security so as to turn the global village into a big stage for common development rather than an arena where gladiators fight. While advocating a peaceful and open-minded approach for greater regional development, Xi, in an apparent reference to territorial disputes with neighboring countries such as Japan, said China would properly handle differences and frictions with relevant countries, but would also continue to press its claims. And that's the key. That's the line. On the basis of firmly upholding its sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity, China will maintain good relations with its neighbors and overall peace and stability in our region. Let me go back again. On the basis of firmly upholding its sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity, China promises to be everybody's friend. An analyst at South Korea's Inje University said China has some say over its economic relations with the North, but doesn't have the power to say don't do it when it comes to nuclear weapons and political and military issues. North Korea is not listening to China. So that's an interesting take. South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said on Meet the Press, the North Koreans need to understand if they attack an American interest or an ally of this country, they're going to pay a heavy price. I could see a major war happening if the North Koreans overplay their hand this time, because the public in South Korea, the United States, and I think the whole region is fed up with this guy. Graham also mentioned the United States needs to keep an eye on Syria, crazy people and nuclear weapons who proliferate those weapons throughout the world, who support terrorist organizations, are incredibly dangerous. That's why we need to stop Syria from getting chemical weapons, which need to be controlled in the country. The Ayatollahs in Iran are just as crazy as this guy in North Korea. Graham added, this could be a nightmare in the making with these chemical weapons falling into radical Islamists. The number of radical jihadists on the ground in Syria today is growing every day this war goes on. Very briefly, the nuclear talks, as you probably noticed, failed in Almaty, Kazakhstan. Iran and 6 world powers, the P5, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and Germany failed to reach agreement Saturday in an approach to reducing fears that Tehran might use its nuclear technology to make weapons. With the EU's foreign policy chief, that's Catherine Ashton, declaring that the two sides remain far apart on substance. I might revisit that issue tomorrow. So when news of Margaret Thatcher's death was announced this morning, I was watching CNBC, and I have to admit I was irritated by their far-right anchor, who was flat out rude to his female co-anchor when she just tried to point out that Margaret Thatcher was controversial. This fellow said she really wasn't. He just doesn't know his history. I loved Margaret Thatcher, but I certainly recognize why some didn't. Just ask the Irish. They don't love Margaret Thatcher. So Thatcher became Britain's first Prime Minister, female Prime Minister, in May 1979, and famously quoted from St. Francis of Assisi as she arrived at number 10 Downing Street, promising to bring harmony where there was discord and hope where there was despair. Sound familiar? Pope Francis? Her radical belief-driven brand of conservatism, Thatcherism as it became known, carried her to 2 further election victories, although she became a figure of hate in parts of the country, especially after the miners' strike of 1984-85. Arguably, her greatest achievement was on the international stage with Ronald Reagan. In the White House and Mikhail Gorbachev in the Kremlin, Mrs. Thatcher was instrumental in ending the Cold War. Gorbachev, identified by Thatcher as a man she could do business with after their first meeting in 1984, spoke today of his sadness at Lady Thatcher's death. He said that she had been a politician whose word had considerable weight. From the United States, I liked what President Obama said in leading the tributes. He said that Americans would never forget how she stood shoulder to shoulder with President Reagan in the 1980s. With the passing of Baroness Margaret Thatcher, the world has lost one of the great champions of freedom and liberty, and America has lost a true friend, Obama said. As a grocer's daughter who rose to become Britain's first female prime minister, she stands as an example to our daughters that there is no glass ceiling that can't be shattered. As Prime Minister, she helped restore the confidence and pride that has always been the hallmark of Britain at its best. Gerry Adams of Sinn Féin in Ireland said her espousal of old draconian militaristic policies prolonged the war and caused great suffering. But the people of the Falkland Islands paid unalloyed tribute to the woman whose resolute reaction to the Argentinian invasion in 1982 saw the islands reclaimed by a British task force after a brief but bloody conflict. Tony Blair, whose 3 election victories echoed Mrs. Thatcher's, said Margaret Thatcher was a towering political figure. Very few leaders get to change not only the political landscape of their country but of the world. Margaret was such a leader. Blair continued, her global impact was vast, and some of the changes she made in Britain were, in certain respects at least, retained by the 1997 Labour government and came to be implemented by governments around the world. As a person, she was kind and generous-spirited and was always immensely supportive to me as Prime Minister, although we came from opposite sides of politics. Blair concluded, even if you disagreed with her as I did on certain issues and occasionally strongly, you could not disrespect her character or her contribution to Britain's national life. She will be sadly missed. Born in 1925 in Grantham, Lincolnshire, Margaret Hilda Roberts was the younger daughter of the corner shop grocer, Alfred Roberts. Alfred was a self-made man, a liberal alderman, and a father whose tenets of integrity, hard work, and self-reliance were strong influences throughout Margaret's career. I love this. His younger daughter's self-belief manifested itself early. Told by a teacher how lucky she was to have won a poetry reading concert, how lucky she was to have won a poetry reading contest, the 10-year-old Margaret replied, "I was not lucky, I deserved it." Oh, God bless her. When her husband Dennis, whom she had described as her rock, died in 2003, age 88, she paid him an emotional tribute. Being Prime Minister is a lonely job. In a sense, it ought to be. You cannot lead from a crowd, but with Dennis there, I was never alone. What a man, what a husband, what a friend. For many, her philosophy was summed up in a magazine interview she gave in 1987. This is from the BBC. Quote, "I think we have gone through a period when too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it is the government's job to cope with it. Or, I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it. I am homeless, the government must house me. And so they are casting their problems on society, and who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves and then also to help look after our neighbor, and life is a reciprocal business, and people have got the entitlements too much in mind without the obligations." That was Margaret Thatcher. I'm just going to leave you with a little Vera Lynn. If Margaret Thatcher was born in a time that evolved into World War II, Vera Lynn, who is still alive today at 96, is the famous English singer and actress, born in what is now known today as East London. Dame Vera Lynn, I should say. Totally loved to this day by the British. In 2005, she made a surprise appearance at VE Day, the Diamond Jubilee. I don't believe she sang at this appearance. She was 88. But she gave a little speech, and she said in her speech, "These boys gave their lives, and some came home badly injured. And for some families, life would never be the same. We should always remember, we should never forget, and we should teach the children to remember." That was Vera Lynn. God save the Queen.